The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was a sweatshop that manufactured textiles in New York during the early 20th century. Mostly immigrants and illiterate women were employed at this factory. Working conditions in the factory were dismal. Cramped spaces, dust suspended in the air, and dangerous equipment were all factors that these women had to deal with on a daily basis. These workers were mostly immigrants from Europe and did not speak any English. There were also no laws in place who set standards on how much these workers were paid, and were merely paid $15 per week and 12 hours per day, 7 days a week, which is equivalent to about $380 for 84 hours. Most of these women were very young and varied from ages 10 to 22. On March 25, 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory burned down, killing 146 workers, 58 who died from jumping off of one of the 12 stories in which the factory operated out. The tragedy of monstrous proportions took place in only 33 minutes. The factory owners had locked the doors to increase productivity, so nobody could steal any cloth. The fire escapes were in poor condition, and all other exits were incredibly small. The machines were mostly made out of wood, and there were also massive amounts of flammable cloth piled around the factory. The fire started in a bin of dry rags and spread throughout the factory, which had 600 people working in it. And the entirety of the working area burned in about 33 minutes due to nearly everything in the factory being completely flammable. The disaster caused many laws to protect the workers to be passed and made working conditions safer all across the United States. Many New Yorkers were upset at the fact that the fire could have been prevented, and frowned at the unacceptable and inhumane working conditions. Up to this point in time, labor unions in the United States had much less power than they would ever have. But the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was an incident that increased their power. After the fire, over 80,000 factory union workers protested the streets demanding changes in labor laws. At the funeral of the 146 that died in the fire, over 100,000 union workers and sympathetic New Yorkers attended the funeral. 155 of the surviving witnesses testified to a grand jury that the doors were locked and that the working conditions were far too poor to be safe, and that the managers of the factory should be held accountable for this incident. The grand jury failed to find evidence of manslaughter, which was a crime the witnesses were pressing for. But this was the beginning of a reform of working conditions. When the case was closed in court, many people's minds began to turn against corporations. This was the beginning of a new era of laws being passed to protest workers. From 1911 to 1914, the New York Factory Investigating Committee was created, whose primary purpose was to inspect factories to make sure they were safe environments, and to make sure incidents like the Triangle Factory would never happen again in New York City. The committee also investigated and passed bills which legally improved wages, working hours, and child labor, since some of the girls working in the Triangle Factory were not graduates of middle school. In 1950, the committee shut down because its mission was complete. 36 laws protecting workers were drafted to the New York State Legislature and went on to serve as a model for many other states' labor laws. In 1935, movements led to national labor reforms for minimum wage, working age, working conditions, and various insurances for workers. Most of this can be traced to the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire.
Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire not only inspired multiple changes in legislature, but it also inspired multiple new forms of literature. One of these pieces of literature was a poem called Eyewitness to the Triangle by William G. Shepard.
I was walking through Washington Square when a puff of smoke issuing from the factory building caught my eye. I reached the building before the alarm was turned on. I saw every feature of the tragedy visible from outside the building. I learned a new sound, a more horrible sound than description can picture. It was the thud of a speeding living body on a stone sidewalk. Thud dead, thud dead, thud dead, thud dead. 62 thud deads. I call them that because the sound and the thought of death came to me each time, at the same instant. There was plenty of chance to watch them as they came down. The height was about 8 feet. The first 10 thud deads shocked me. I looked up, saw that there were scores of girls at the windows. The flames from the floor below were beating in their faces. Somehow I knew that they too must come down, and something within me, something that I didn't know was there, steeled me. I even watched one girl falling, waving her arms, trying to keep her body upright, until the very instant she struck the sidewalk, she was trying to balance herself. Then came the thud, then a silent, unmoving pile of clothing and twisted, broken limbs. As I reached the scene of the fire, a cloud of smoke hung over the building. I looked up the 7th floor. There was a living picture in each window. 4 screaming heads of girls waving their arms. "Call a fireman!" they screamed. Scores of them. "Get a ladder!" cried others. They were all as alive and whole and sound as we who stood on the sidewalk. I couldn't help thinking of that. We cried to them not to jump. We heard the siren of a fire engine in the distance. The other sirens sounded from several directions. "Here they come," we yelled. "Don't jump. Stay here." One girl climbed onto the window sash. Those behind her tried to hold her back. Then she dropped into space. I didn't notice whether those above watched her drop because I turned away. Then came the first thud. I looked up. Another girl was climbing onto the windowsill. Others were crowding behind her. She dropped. I watched her fall, and again the dreadful sound. 2 windows away, 2 girls were climbing onto the sill. They were fighting each other and crowding for air. Behind them, I saw many screaming heads. They fell almost together, but I heard 2 distinct thuds. Then the flames burst out through the windows on the flames below them and curled up into their faces. The firemen began to raise a ladder. Others took out a life net, and while they were rushing to the sidewalk with it, 2 more girls shot down. The firemen held it under them. The bodies broken. The grotesque smile of a dog jumping through a hoop struck me. Before they could move the net, another girl's body flashed through it. The thuds were just as loud. It seemed as if they had not been there yet. It seemed to me that the thuds were so loud that they might have been heard all over the city. I had counted 10. Then my dull sense began to work automatically. I noticed things that it had not occurred to me before the notice. Little details for the first shock had blinded me too. I looked up to see whether those above watched those who fell. I noticed that they did. They watched them every inch of the way down and probably heard the roaring thuds that we heard.